Hi, it's Rob Herman, and welcome to the Super Performers Podcast powered by 4100FS. As we worked on developing this podcast, our overriding goal was to create a compelling platform for accessible insights on work and life from successful, driven, and highly accomplished leaders. Leaders with unique experiences across a wide variety of fields, including business, medicine, law, sports, entertainment, education, and philanthropy, among others. In my head, I started to work through a fascinating group I wanted as guests, and I got pretty excited. I've gotten to know these people through my own varied experiences early in my career on Capitol Hill, later working on Wall Street, being an entrepreneur, and today running a company called 4100FS while also focusing on community engagement. I think you'll really enjoy hearing the stories of these guests, learning about their respective paths, finding out what motivates them and how they define success. Glad to have you with us in the Super Performers Podcast. And without further ado, on to our guest today. Our guest today on the Super Performers Podcast is Gifford Miller. The Honorable Gifford Miller's career in city government culminated in 4 years as Speaker of the New York City Council from 2002 to 2006. Under his leadership, the council led the city's response to the fiscal crisis, which resulted from September 11th. He passed landmark legislation with council to protect children from lead paint poisoning, established the city's earned income tax credit, created the Green Buildings Program, and established inclusionary housing and land use rezonings. After more than a decade of experience at the highest levels of New York City government, Gifford Miller co-founded Signature Urban Properties in 2007 to pursue transformational development in transitional urban areas. As Signature's co-managing principal, Gifford Miller has led multiple projects strengthening and enhancing New York City's neighborhoods. Gifford's active with a number of New York's leading nonprofits, serving on the board of the Friends of the High Line, the New York State Association for Affordable Housing, and is the chairman of both the Center for an Urban Future and New York City Outward Bound Schools. More recently, and we'll get into this, Gifford has become, through a fund called Signature Football Advisors, the owner of a professional Portuguese soccer club. Gifford, welcome. It's a pleasure after our long friendship to have you on the Super Performers Podcast. Glad to have you here and looking forward to the conversation ahead.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I got to start off by thinking, we were talking about this before we started recording the podcast, about how we actually met in the early days of our careers at a training for Congressional Research Service as congressional aides. And I just started thinking about our experiences in DC and time together with you and your now wife, Pam. I think it was not just the Congressional Research Service that started off our friendship, but also we had a mutual friend, Michael Goldberg, who's done some pretty cool things in his own right, your classmate from Princeton.
He's a legend.
He's a legend. He's got a massive open online course on global entrepreneurship with, I think, something like 200,000 people. So he's an interesting guy, along with your other classmates from Princeton, including your superstar wife, Pam, that are part of this equation. But I think we started to become friends around that time at a dinner. And I'm just curious to start things off. We'll get into your background, but what's your recollection of that time working in DC? You started as a low-level aide and you worked your way up to chief of staff in a congressional office. Those were the early days of your career. Any specific recollections of that?
I mean, it was an interesting time. I mean, I graduated from college in '92. I remember being super excited about Bill Clinton. I remember going to the first State of the Union, and I was intent on leading every single possible standing ovation. So I think there were like 47 standing ovations, and I felt somewhat responsible for like 3 of them. And maybe four. But also in the end, I remember kind of tiring of Washington D.C. pretty quickly, and I was very fortunate. I started out working for, as you say, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney. She hired me to answer her phones, and then she let me answer her mail, and then she let me do an issue or two. And the key to my success was basically my 5th grade animal project was like where I learned to sort things and present clearly. And so NAFTA came up, and we needed somebody to do a book on NAFTA that had all the pros and cons and laid it out clearly. So I did, the same way I kind of had a project on I think it was on the beaver. And it was in, a nice little...
a lot of similarities between...
Very similar,
the Animal Project, yes.
Well, I mean, I think, given we're not sure what the impact of either is yet, it's too soon to tell. But I had tabs, and it was clean, and it was clear, and she really liked it. And so she asked me to move back to New York City and run her office, and then she just wanted, folders with tabs for everything. And so I would pick her up when she would fly back into New York, and I'd hand her the weekend folder with tabs and her speeches and everything, and she loved it. And then she made me her chief of staff, and yeah, it was a time of a lot of change quite quickly. She was very good to me.
And I was just going to say that for people that don't know how a congressional office works, to move from a low-level staffer to chief of staff in that time frame is pretty rare and unique.
I was the New York chief of staff, which was not the same. I wasn't running her DC office. So just that's what they called AAs. That was like if you were the top of the top, you were the AA. I don't know if they still do it. So weird.
I never understood that title of administrative assistant
as being the top
dog in a congressional office, but still, I mean, the reality is what you're describing, and you're a humble guy, so you're kind of underselling it a little bit, but to go do that in 3 years is pretty remarkable. And I want to come back to what happened next in a second, but let me back up a little bit because I've gotten to know your family over time reasonably well. And so I'm thinking about your parents, your brother Marshall, who was also in DC at that time, also your brother Ethan, who I got to know actually when I lived in New York. But your dad, Lee, was a State Department official in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations.
He was.
Your mom, your mom, Lyndon, well-known designer of public gardens, Wagner Park, Bryant Park, the New York Botanical Garden. I've seen her place in Connecticut and have a pretty good sense of her talents, even on that level too, the Conservatory Garden on Fifth Avenue. But when I think about, kind of public service and your drive, I know that your parents both served in a community board. I think it was Community Board 11 in East Harlem. Tell me a little bit about what that public service mentality, because your brother, Marshall, is an assistant U.S. attorney, has done really well in the public sector.
Well, he's currently the number 3 person in the Department of Justice. So yeah, he's busy. He's very, very busy. He gets really a lot of phone calls.
I can only imagine what his day-to-day is like. But when you think about those roots of community service, doesn't even need to be in the public sector, but just philanthropy. Let me hear a little bit from you about how that shaped your worldview from an early age and your desire to connect with the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In my family, the notion of public service is super important. And also, I think the examples that, my parents and my brother, but particularly my parents set of just doing it, so my father picked up his life and moved to Washington, D.C. from San Francisco when Kennedy was elected. My oldest brother was in the Kennedy kindergarten. You see pictures of Caroline Kennedy wandering around the White House. They needed other kids. They needed other kids that age to fill it out. You can't really have a kindergarten without other kids. So he's often in those pictures. And my mother was a painter and an artist, and then she, had the opportunity to redesign and refurbish the Conservatory Garden in Central Park, which today is this enormous success. But at the time that she was given the project in 1982, it was not by any means assumed that public space was going to be valued or important. And she just did it. She went out, she raised the money, and she refurbished it. And that's actually her success there caused her to be basically hired to do literally almost any flower you see in New York City as a result of my mother. Actually, she started something called the Daffodil Project after September 11th, and 11 million daffodils have been planted in New York City, ribbons of yellow to remember the victims of September 11th. So, both of them, weren't afraid to just go out and do things. I remember particularly thinking about my father who passed last year, and I was thinking a lot about him, obviously. And one of the things that really impressed me about my father, and I think was important to me entering into a public career, is that he didn't apologize for who he was, and he felt comfortable where he wanted to be. So he, as you say, he served on the community board in East Harlem for more than 20 years. And in the 80s and the 90s, when New York wasn't the safest city in the country the way it is today, he would trot off to East Harlem, and he didn't like apologize for himself. He was a guy who wore a blazer and a tie, and so he would roll up to the 124th Street community board hearing wearing his blazer and tie and looking like the Yale graduate that he was. But also, he was a guy who came from very middle. His parents were both teachers in Olympia, Washington. So I think kind of not apologizing and being comfortable, but also being the sort of person who wants to understand what other people are feeling and understanding, something that I got very much from my dad, and that helped out a lot in my political career and all careers, really.
He was a good man. I enjoyed my conversations with him. Your mom is obviously a phenomenally accomplished person, but I think it's interesting what you're talking about is that the feeling of empathy and also feeling comfortable in your own skin, which is, I think, professionally, personally, such an ongoing struggle for a lot of people. And we're always learning and maturing. But I think what you highlighted is really important. So, I also wanted to ask you a little bit about going to boarding school. I know most people don't have that perspective of what that's like to go away from home. You went to Middlesex boarding school.
I did.
I will note that based on earlier conversations, and I saw it in some news clippings of you, that apparently you ran for president of school and lost miserably. You made up for it later.
I don't know that I lost miserably, but I did lose.
A quote in some publication, so maybe it was just fake news.
I probably said it.
But what was it like? I mean, because it's hard to go away from home at a young age. But what was the experience like, and how did it shape you at that point?
I mean, it was great. I loved it. I was very young for my class when I went to elementary school. I was like the youngest kid or almost the youngest kid in my class, and I grew late. So when I graduated from ninth grade, the first time I graduated from ninth grade, I was 5 feet tall and I weighed 95 pounds, and I was still, not within shouting distance of puberty. And that was a challenge at that age. So when I went to boarding school, I did ninth grade over again, which made me seem smarter because I didn't have to do all the classes over again, but I got a lot of APs in. And, it was fun. It was like camp. I mean, it was hard. You get some people, you can't go home and get away from your classmates. So when when things don't go well, it's not so great. But mostly it was like going to camp. I enjoyed it. And it's an example of how different, all of our generation's experiences and relationships with our parents. I mean, I would say I was very close with my parents, but like, it didn't feel weird at all to be going up to boarding school. Pretty normal. And like the way like now our kids call, like, right before I got on this podcast, my son was calling me, asking me about what the password is for our cell phone thing, so he can get a cell phone. The kind of, I talk to my kids 2 or 3 times a day, fairly often. They're both graduated from college. That was not the case when I graduated from college. So it was an intense experience, but it was fun.
It must have made the transition to college pretty straightforward and simple. You went to Princeton for undergrad. You majored in poli-sci, which, given what happened next in your career, made a lot of sense. And I noted before, Pam, who I'm a huge fan of, as you know, and is a superstar attorney in New York City. You met her at Princeton. You met some good lifelong friends as well.
Yeah.
And I know you also dealt with, some difficult times there too, having lost somebody close to you in an accident. But overall, Princeton, and kind of where it led you post-graduation, what kind of you think about boarding school versus Princeton? Was that just a natural progression from where you had been before at Middlesex, and it felt smooth? Was there a transition period, and how?
I think it's easier for people who went to boarding school to get comfortable in college. Yeah. It's just sort of it's like more of the same with less rules. So that's easy. I wouldn't say that Princeton was super important to me, as you say. I met my wife. I have some, most of my closest friends still are in class with me. But I don't think there was anything about my particular Princeton experience that led me to, where I ended up in politics. In fact, going to Princeton was probably unhelpful. I had to undo that part, and not play it up. I remember I was a member of the Princeton Club, and I took some other council member to the Princeton Club for a drink or lunch or something. He was like, "Dude, don't do this again." This is not a good look. So I think, I don't know that I hope my kids and other people get more out of college than I got out of college, from an academic and other perspective. But, I got an awful lot of friends and that's what counts in life. So can't.
Yeah, absolutely. That sense of community around you and the friends that you keep. Yeah, I want to come back to that a little bit later when you talk about that little anecdote about taking another council member to the Princeton Club, because I know one of the things when you ran for Speaker of City Council that you were all over the city. You didn't want to be buttonholed as this Upper East Side council member who didn't know the entire city. And, with your background, sometimes, Princeton is not necessarily going to play well across the various boroughs, but I think you did an unbelievable job. And I want to come back to that because when I think about that and the connections you made with people, it's pretty phenomenal. But now we talked a little bit about the early days of you working in DC. You moved back to New York. You become the chief of staff in the congresswoman's office. Then there's a special election, midterm election. You were, I think, 26th at the time. Walk me through the decision to run, pull the trigger. Did it start off as a novel idea and you're like, hey, I could actually do this? How did that all manifest?
I was actually 25 when I decided to run. And I think, if I have a strength, it's generally speaking that I'm not, I have had a tendency to not be afraid to leap, and to even maybe leap a little earlier than other people would, So basically what happened was the guy who was the city council member from one of the areas that I actually wasn't living in it at the time, had been Carolyn's opponent in 94. And
Carolyn Maloney was the congresswoman you worked for.
Carolyn Maloney was the congresswoman that I was working for. And he was a Republican. At that time, the whole Upper East Side was generally represented by Republicans, except for Carolyn and one assemblyman. And she had just beaten a Republican named Bill Green, who'd been there for many, many years in what was considered a huge upset. And so it was clear that this guy, Charlie Millard, wasn't interested in being in the city council, where as a Republican, he was in a, tiny minority. He'd run for city council in order to run for Congress. So he started looking around for jobs, and there were all these rumors that he was going to get different jobs. And basically, I was living in the West Village. I'd just bought my first apartment, and about 6 months previously, because this was back when, just as an aside, I bought my first apartment in the West Village for $140,000. So that tells you how long ago it was. And God, do I wish I still owned it. If I still owned it, I don't know. There lots more things would be possible. But anyway, I basically decided that I was going to run for the city council in that district, like on Friday. And on like Monday, I signed a lease, and I just started running before he quit. And so what that meant was, by the time he quit, it was a special election. It was a brief special election, and ended up taking it through my birthday. And so I was 26 when I was first elected, and I had already started running. So it just made it easier for everybody to just kind of rally around me. And Carolyn was great again in being very supportive of me. And so I think, sort of being ready and willing to just sort of commit yourself before others are willing to, because there were like all these other people that were thinking about it. Actually, Al Gore's son-in-law at the time was a candidate, but he didn't get in until 5 days after the race started and didn't get enough signatures to get on the ballot, or at least we knocked him off. So anyway, it was, I think it was important to, and I found in general in my life that if you want to do something, now is better than later. if you want to get it done.
Yeah, that's great advice. I thought it was really interesting. And again, I remember having this conversation a long time ago with you and Pam, but it was interesting. There was a New York Times Magazine article about you, a long time ago when you were a speaker.
That was a great piece, man. That was the pinnacle of my positive press. After I think Mike Bloomberg read that and was like, tear this dude apart. And so they worked on it after that. But yeah, that was a good piece.
Well, the funny thing is that you and I happened to be together that weekend. You had invited me out to Connecticut for the weekend. So I was actually with you when that piece came out, and I read that, and I'm like, you can't get any more positive press.
No, that's awesome. John Colapinto. Thank you, John. If you're listening to this podcast, I want to thank you again for that lovely, lovely profile. And literally, it's been all downhill since there.
I'm not sure about that, but I do think it was an amazing piece, and I think it was a cover story. It was very prominently displayed
it was.
Yeah, and it's funny because even
it was entitled "The Kid and His Counsel."
Yeah, well, I want to come back to the article because there's some great quotes in there, but one of them was talking about how you were an unbelievable street campaigner. I remember because I used to once in a while come with you when you were running or various events and things like that. And you were unbelievable in making people feel like, even though you were on the subway or wherever in your district, making people feel like you were focused completely on them. And I remember, I think you were doing it at some point 16 hours a day of campaigning. You were unbelievable and unbelievably gifted at it. Did you feel like that you just found something that you were unbelievably gifted in doing in terms of the way you would connect with people on a street campaign level?
Well, clearly I wasn't gifted enough because I lost that mayoral campaign pretty resoundingly. But
there's a lot of
there were other reasons for that. And essentially, retail politics don't make any difference in a race like the mayor. But I think that I don't know there's as much contrast as you'd think. Like it's, like I always, I used to, I was periodically in plays and, essentially campaigning is a, when you're doing it, you're performing, and so there's a lot of people that are shy that are great performers, like my shtick used to be singing as I know, and so when I went to senior centers, I've
heard you sing a Neil Diamond song here or there. Yes, yeah. I have.
When I used to go to senior centers and I would make the person who was running the senior center make me sing. They'd be like, we hear the speaker sings. You want to hear him sing? And I would, no, okay. And I think, there's a difference between sort of, how you feel personally and, how you, when you're sort of having to invest a character. I would sing Young at Heart, I would look out. They told me I'm coming to a senior center. I don't see any seniors here, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so I feel like, the thing, as you mentioned, it was incredibly exhausting because you have to be on all the time. And particularly in that time when, when I had a lot of staff around, I had a security detail, you were really never by yourself. And as you say, I was working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it was, it took me years after that to really actually fully get all my energy back. It was exhausting, but it was exciting. And there was a lot of positive stuff that I got to do. And it has helped me in the rest of my career. And so I enjoyed being speaker.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about you being speaker, especially the aftermath of 9/11, which was such an incredibly difficult time to be dealing with the work of the city. But, since you got into it a little bit about the long days, I had talked to you and Pam. You guys had just gotten back from vacation and you were relaxed and you're about to get back on the hamster wheel. And, I thought about that when I was preparing for this conversation with you today in terms of two things. One, how, when you were effectively in your early 30s and speaker and had that security detail everywhere with you and just an endless array of events and things to go to, how that impacted your mindset, your ego, your day-to-day mindset in terms of what you were doing. And in a related note, because I know it did impact you from a stress perspective, we've subsequently in recent years had conversations about meditation, for example. But like when you're going through that, you're young to be dealing with all that attention. I think you handled it with incredible grace, but I know it had to be stressful. And I'm just curious, and for anybody listening to this from a broader context, being put with that much power and authority at a young age and so much responsibility, how it impacted your day-to-day mindset.
That's a good question. I think, I don't know. I really don't actually have much to share with other people. So, you do what you have to do. I mean, it was a really fascinating, difficult time. As you say, September 11th happened. I mean, there were so many different things that had to come together to make me the speaker of the city council. And September 11th was one of them, actually, because if Mark Green was supposed to get elected mayor, he was from Manhattan. And lived, 10 blocks from me. If he had been elected mayor, there's no way that I ever would have been speaker of the city council. Only because Mike Bloomberg got elected, which only happened because suddenly Rudy Giuliani his endorsement was actually valuable and for a brief period here in New York. And so there were just so many different things that had to happen. Among them that I had to put myself in a position to be able to be elected. And to not give up. And I mean, in many ways, the worst campaign I ever did was the one for speaker, because it was like running for class president, and there's only 51 votes, and it was all gossip and rumor, and it was really, really exhausting, but exciting in the end, and a great privilege. And when I was there. I was so young. Maybe I was too young to really think about what all the stress meant and all the rest of that. But things came at you and you had to deal with them.
Yeah. Well, I think to talk a little bit more about how you became speaker, I mean, you came up with this strategy where, we talked before about Upper East Side and that anecdote about taking another council member out to the Princeton Club. But you went to all 50 districts. You backed candidates. You offered your services as a campaigner, a money raiser and supporter. Tons of skepticism when you started doing this that you could win. And you were at it for a long period of time just to get to that point. And you really got to know the whole city, which must be an incredible perspective to have, and probably informed to some extent what came next with urban redevelopment and the work you've done there. But you won in a unanimous vote. Was there self-doubt creeping in it during this process, or were you just kind of approaching it as, I have a plan of attack, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to approach it, and you could live with the consequences either way?
Well, okay, so first of all, the fact was that when I was elected to the city council in January of 1996, it was a weird time in New York politics because term limits had been adopted in 1993 and were going to go into effect for the first time in 2001. And so what that meant is that I was going to be the senior elected official in the city of New York in January of 2002, right after the elections in 2001. And so there was an enormous amount of upheaval that was happening. There were new borough presidents, new public advocate, new controller, and 38 of the 51 city council members were going to be new. And so I knew that there was, for me, it was like, if you're going to be a city council member, you might as well be the speaker of the city council, right? It's what, if you want to do things, it's a lot easier to do if you're the speaker and you're running the body than if you're just a regular city council member. So it struck me as worth pursuing. And I remember, but I knew that if I didn't do something, that there was zero chance, because generally those kinds of decisions were made. The speaker did not come from Manhattan, precisely because the mayor usually did come from Manhattan. And those decisions were made by a bunch of county leaders and sort of pols outside of the city council. And so I knew that if I didn't do something fairly dramatic, that no matter how, much I thought about it, it wasn't going to happen. And that basically my theory, and this is generally a theory of elections and politics, is that you have to put yourself into the mix, and then you need things to break your way, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. But if you're not in the mix, they can't break your way. And so I remember explaining this idea to my wife at Pig Heaven, which is a Chinese restaurant on 2nd Avenue at that time. It's moved recently. And my idea, I was inspired by Newt Gingrich and GoPac, if you remember the contract with America in '94. And that's how he became speaker, was he created this thing and he went around and he endorsed and helped candidates. And so no one had actually ever done that before in New York. Now everybody does it, but then no one had done it. And so, again, it was just like basically, well, if I don't do it, nothing good will happen. If I do it, it's a lot of work, but hopefully something good will happen. And I enjoyed it. As you say, it was an amazing, and I think important for me in a way that I don't know that I anticipated, opportunity to spend, time all over New York, which is such an incredibly diverse and amazing city, and so, I mean, I've literally knocked on doors and walked up and down back elevator and staircases of buildings pretty much in every neighborhood of this city. And I learned a lot about New York, and I think was ultimately a better speaker for it, and the relationships that I built with ultimately some of the candidates who won, and some didn't, but even there, I could identify with what the issues were and how people were feeling about their districts. So it was a great experience.
Well, incredible. And in my subjective opinion, as your friend for many years, I'm glad the city had you there in the aftermath of 9/11 with the fiscal crisis. It made a big difference. It does crack me up to read some of these quotes. I referenced that article earlier. And I'm just going to read two of them. He looks like a boy on a school field trip, but then there's a sudden edge in his voice and authority that erases all traces of the kid in him. He has managed in 60 minutes, you were at Con Ed at the time, he has managed in 60 minutes to master the entire Con Ed network that brings power to every home in business in the city of New York. And I thought those were great quotes. And, I'm sure your ego didn't suffer from that. But it does kind of lead to my next question about leadership style, because this was true for your campaign for being the Speaker of City Council, but it also takes a fair degree of confidence to build that consensus. And that's even your opponents in the speaker race talked about how you were open and responsive to concerns and positions of members. That was from Albert Van, who ran against you. But that consensus building is something I think that's a hallmark of your personal relationships too, in terms of being open-minded and listening to other people. But talk to me a little bit about how that worked for you in being speaker, or how it didn't work for you in certain situations.
Well, I think the through line in my career is that I like to do complicated things that require other people's involvement, and the key to getting other people to do things is to make them believe that it's entirely in their self-interest, because people act in their self-interest. Asking people to act against their self-interest is a pretty quick recipe for being disappointed. And so I think it means, you have to therefore think carefully about what is it that the other person, wants and needs in any particular situation. And you have to understand them enough to be able to know that if you're going to sell them something. It's sort of, it's trite, but everybody says, everything is sales, and there's some truth to it, and so, I think, there were some people for whom, who I was just a bridge too far. And, I definitely got accused of being, arrogant young little fellow, not infrequently, but I did my best to try to address that, and that wasn't how I felt in my mind. And in the end, my success, and the legislative body is a great example. Like, you can be the speaker, but you can't do anything by yourself in the city council. And we had an extremely diverse group of legislators. All of it's like they all thought, of course, that they would be doing a better job of my job than I was, half the time. And that's a challenge, but that's democracy.
Yeah. You were still young at this point. How much did on the whole, you got really positive reviews. I read you a couple of them, but when people did say something that was unkind or unfair, how much did that affect you? You were young, and I don't know how thick-skinned you were at that point in time, but maturity and age brings thicker skin. So was that difficult for you? Or how difficult was it for you? I guess I should ask.
The thick skin thing wasn't that hard for me. I'm okay with who I am, and I got called an awful lot of stuff in various times, but I am I like to think that I'm slow to anger. I think it's about understanding other people's perspectives. So if people say bad things, if you understand why they're doing it and where they're coming from, it doesn't necessarily always feel so bad. And I do think, so I picked my fights very carefully, and not that frequently. And if I didn't like somebody or if I was really upset, I would never let them know, and I think that works out better because you never really know, like people who you thought, I remember there's one guy who super crazy angry at me, at the beginning of the time when I was elected speaker because I didn't make him the chairman of something. Well, even though he was supporting my opponent. So of course I didn't make him chairman of something. And there were several council members actually who weren't supporters of mine when I started, and then were big supporters of mine when I ran for mayor. And I think, if I had gotten into some big fight with them at the beginning, which I avoided doing, it wouldn't have gone in that way. It just so. I do think, though, with perspective, I was young. I might have been a better speaker 10 years later with a little bit more life experience, but. I think the one thing I regret that there are certain things that I wasn't just stronger and tougher on. Like, for example, I feel like there's so much work to be done around the foster care system in this city. We have so many kids that are in our care. I tried to do some work there, but I didn't focus clearly and hardly and carefully enough on it. I wish I'd had more time and more focus for that. So I think, ideally, we all learn from our experiences. I might have made a better speaker 10 years later, but I also might not have had as much energy because we get more experience, but we lose our willingness to work quite as hard, or at least I do.
Yeah. Well, the foster care system mentioned resonates with me. It's some of the philanthropic work I'm involved in, and it's a problem that's very difficult to solve. Unfortunately, it's moved in the wrong direction with opioid addiction and post-COVID and things like that.
Yeah.
So we hope for better days ahead. So that really resonates. Well, okay, so let's move now to after you came out of public office and thought about what came next, and you've been thinking about that for a while. Was that difficult? I'm not sure what your mindset was coming out. Did you take a break? Did you think, okay, I'm moving directly into what ended up being a pretty interesting and impactful career in urban redevelopment? And how hard was it mentally to adjust from being in public service as an elected official to doing what came next?
Well, taking the first piece last, for me, it wasn't that hard. There are a lot of, I would say, maybe even a vast majority of elected officials that when they get out of office, just want to get back in, need to be in.
A lot of those guys.
As they say from Hamilton, they need to be in the room. I was not that guy. And in fact, I appreciate your glossing over my mayoral campaign where I finished 4th out of 4. And there were some complicated.
You were almost in the top 3, so you got that going.
I was almost in the top 3, but the good part about finishing 4th was, like, for me, it was like, okay, well, now I don't feel like I gotta, like, I was so close that I gotta try again, and so I took a pretty big break. I closed that aspect of my career. Have really no interest in going back, and never really had any interest in going back into public office. because the only job that's better being speaker is mayor, and I'm not going to get elected mayor anytime soon. So, so it was pretty easy for me to break from that, and I think, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And the thing I think that the best advice I got was like, don't try to leap into something too quickly. So basically, I did some consulting where I gave advice to people who wanted to pay me to give me advice. Like, for example, the Yankees retained me. And I'm not sure exactly what it was, but I think it was because I was actually quite adept at making George Steinbrenner laugh. And so I would go into his box and I'd make him laugh, and they paid me a little bit, not crazy amount of money, but a little bit of money every month. And
by the way, I just want to mention as a side note on Steinbrenner, I met him one time. I walked up to him cold and asked him for a favor, and he could not have been a nicer guy. So I know his reputation is very different than that, but for what it's worth,
he was very good to me. He loved Pam. He loved my kids. I was sort of not weird. I wasn't afraid of him. So that didn't happen all that often. And I would say things that made him laugh. And everybody else liked it because it would cut the tension. His box was generally a pretty tense place. There's a lot of Steinbrenner stories, but that's a different podcast. So the thing I didn't do is I didn't leap quickly, and I basically took the time to sort of invest in myself. And so instead of going to try and find a job working for somebody else as their lobbyist or their spokesperson or whatever, I built my own affordable housing development business from scratch with a partner. And I think that like I said, the best advice I got from some people was that don't hesitate to invest in yourself in this moment of change, and that's basically what I did, and I really enjoyed that career as an affordable housing developer, changing people's lives, changing neighborhoods. It was the stuff that I liked the best at the city council, and to get to do it, from the private sector, but in cooperation with the public sector, and to get paid for it is, pretty good deal.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me, it's a great segue to talking a little bit more about Signature Urban Properties, which you co-founded in 2007, focusing on transitional urban areas. Can you just get into a little bit more detail of what Signature Urban Properties actually does, and maybe an example of some projects you've worked on that have been impactful?
We built about 2,000 units of affordable housing in the Bronx, all in the Bronx. All the housing we built is affordable. We did build one commercial building, which I also, we broke ground on our for the first spec office building in the South Bronx since the 1920s, and 2 months later the pandemic hit. So it was I feel a little responsible. So that was such a crazy thing to do, maybe that it triggered a terrible response, but managed to get through it and actually lease the building in the end to a charter school. But we built the largest project is called Compass Residences. It's along the Sheridan Expressway, and it was a abandoned derelict industrial area. When I was in the council with the mayor and the city planning commission, we designated a bunch of industrial districts as industrial business zones, and made clear that we weren't going to rezone them to change because they were successful, and we didn't want people speculating in them. But that sort of left other industrial zones that sort of the kind of the flip side of that coin. It's like, well, these ones could and probably should be rezoned to do something better. And so we bought up an area along the Sheridan Expressway and over literally, and we're just finishing leasing out the final of what is depending on how you count it, 6 or 7 buildings there along and about 1,500 units of housing, and replacing this derelict industrial area with housing, some park space, a school, and other sorts of amenities that really have changed that area. And it's a great privilege to have had that opportunity.
That's great. That's got to be tremendously rewarding and so needed, and kind of an example for, I think, other people to follow. And so the impact of that lives on, which is also a good start to a conversation about how you choose what to be involved in terms of your boards on the community side, philanthropy. We talked earlier on about your parents and the sense of community service. You're on a lot of boards, or you have been involved in a lot of boards over time. How do you, in what you do day to day, you have an impact anyway, but how do you choose to allocate your time? You obviously have to balance work and life and everything else, but how do you choose, what are the criteria for your community involvement?
Well, I try to pick things that interest me, that I think that where there's a need. So as you mentioned, I chair two nonprofits. One is sort of what I think, and I think most people think, is sort of the preeminent think tank in New York for policy, a really practical, solid, data research driven policy think tank. That, what I liked about it, one reason I joined it was this: when I was in office, a lot of people come to you and tell you that they want you to solve big problems, but not that many come to you with ideas on how to do it. And so when they do, it's like, wow, that's awesome. Thank you. Because all you really want in office is you want to be making a difference. You want to do something that's practical. And that's actually ultimately why I was more interested in the city council and the city than working in Congress. NAFTA being the example, it's like a NAFTA, I guarantee you that everybody who was for NAFTA in 93, was it? And everybody who was against NAFTA, I still thinks that whatever their opinion was in 93, because no one really knows. I mean, incredibly important, but you don't feel it in the way that was city government. So, for example, I was able to work with my college roommate to save the High Line and create this amazing urban park. And now you can walk on it and you can experience it. And so can millions of people who visit the city. And that's the difference between city government and federal government. So I like to look for where I'm only looking for nonprofits that I think make practical, meaningful differences to that. And then also I chair an organization that runs 15 public schools in the public school system and works with another 70 around outward bound principles, which is which figuring out how to bring the sort of the spark that happens in the wilderness that changes kids' lives or young people's lives, and bring that into the classroom every day.
Yeah, it's incredible. And that's it's so meaningful. And on the High Line, for people that haven't been on there, it must be pretty cool. I remember when it was just an idea, and now it's a prominent tourist destination.
It's the number 2 tourist destination in the city. It's one of our challenges. We have to make sure the New Yorkers still want to go, which they do, but it's busy.
Yeah, absolutely, for residents and people coming from out of town alike. Well, let's finish up with something that's a lot of fun, and I know that you're very focused on now, which is spending time in Portugal and becoming the majority shareholder through your fund of a Portuguese soccer club. It's I think through Signature Football Advisors is the fund you manage, and you're extremely involved, because it's one of my favorite emails to read when you send the comings and goings of the soccer club, football club in Portugal. You want to talk a little bit about how you got involved with that and what you're doing now on a day-to-day basis there?
Yeah. So my wife and I visited Lisbon 3 years ago, right as we sent our kids successfully off to college. The previous year had been a sort of a pandemic year, and neither one of them made it through their freshman year. They had the same year because my older one took a gap year after high school. So we sent them off their sophomore year. It looked like they were staying. We landed in Lisbon for our first vacation since pre-pandemic. We fell in love. And again, a little bit like everything else that I've done successfully in my life, with the exception of I dated my wife for 7 years before we got married, but everything else I'm extremely decisive about. And so within like 36 hours, the both of us were like, we have to buy an apartment here and live, and we want to spend a lot of time here. And
that's a pretty quick decision.
It was, but we knew it and we felt it and we love it. And I think part of it is it's a bit of a city that's, something like San Francisco. And my wife grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. We just fell in love and knew it was right. and bought an apartment. And so after that, I started thinking to myself, well, how do I spend time here? And I looked at doing some real estate stuff, which I've been doing privately. But in the end, the thing I was like, well, what do I really want to do? I want to own a football team. I love football, by which I mean soccer. Both of my sons, played it all their lives. I coached them for a while. I've been a lifelong fan of Liverpool. I put myself to sleep thinking about Liverpool lineups to this day. And similar to everything else, my feeling was and remains, I was looking at the football situation in Portugal, and I think that football teams, particularly a year ago, were seriously undervalued because everywhere else in Europe, people are paying stupid money for football teams. And they just haven't started yet in Portugal, although they're beginning to. And so my feeling was, if you don't go do it right now, you'll never do it. And so I did it. And there was a team that was about a 10-minute walk from our apartment. Amazing team, incredible location, fantastic real estate opportunity, right underneath what is essentially the Golden Gate Bridge, which is the main bridge in Lisbon, right in the center of town at the base of the largest park. And they happened to need investment right at the moment that I was looking to invest in a football team. And so it's been, a bit like the rest of my Lisbon experience. I fell in love fast, quickly. And it's been an amazing experience we spent a year working with the club before we actually bought it, in a cooperative arrangement. And so we closed in June, and every day I'm the chairman of the club. So we do everything from choosing players to putting together a nutrition plan, a medical plan, but also renovating the stadium, which needs a lot of work, even though it's an amazing, incredible, romantic experience. There's only one women's toilet in the entire stadium, which could only happen in Portugal. Wow. It's not quite true. But it's directionally true. I do that. It's like just like doing 5 startups at the same time in another country in another language. We have been putting out a merch plan. We have we were named by ESPN. This is amazing. We were named by ESPN as the second best kit in the world. Our jersey.
Yeah. You should tell people how to get to, I don't know how backlogged you are, but how to get to that. The merch is great. The kits are amazing.
You can go to, the name of the club is Atlético, or as they say in Portuguese, Atlético. And it's Atlético, ATLETICO CP for Club de Portugal.com. AtléticoCP.com. Yeah, we have great kit. And we're working on our branding, and our goal is to be everybody in Lisbon's favorite Lisbon team. And we're on our way.
That's a tall order, but I got to tell you, when I read those emails that you send out to people, it exudes that culture of positivity and no excuses. And I know that's kind of what you're going for, in that mindset shift in terms of what this club can become, which is pretty cool to see. You talk about 5 different startups at once. What are the 1-year priorities, or roughly 1 year? What are the 3 and 5 year priorities? Just talk broadly about near term versus intermediate and long term, what you want to accomplish. I know the idea of becoming Lisbon's favorite club is up there, but in terms of specifics, what would you say are the top of list?
Well, first of all, we want to put the best football team out there that we can every game, and we try to win every game. And we're trying to play a brand of football that we think will ultimately win us promotion. As I think most people know, football in Europe and everywhere else in the world, except in the United States, you're on a ladder, and you can go up and you can go down depending upon your performance at any given year. So imagine if like a AA club could ultimately end up in the major leagues. That's what football is like. And so our goal is to move from League 3, where we currently are, to League 2. And we want to have the best possible players that we can. We hired an amazing coach with incredible experience, and a lot of great players. But We play very modern, pressing, aggressive football, and it takes a little while for that to gel, but it's starting to gel. We've won 3 games in a row, and so we're on our way. I hope. So we'd like to go from League 3 to League 2. At the same time, there's an enormous amount of work to build an infrastructure, because the football clubs in Portugal are owned by essentially like the local YMCA. They're all nonprofits. And what happens is when they reach a certain level of football, the nonprofit can't afford to continue to operate the club. So they either go back down to where it's amateur, or they find investors to help pay for it professionally. And so it's an amazing club, extraordinary history, and some fantastic people there that care deeply and are really terrific. But there was almost no resources. So we've had to start from scratch with almost everything: scouting, medical, nutrition. There's as I mentioned, a lot of work to be done to the stadium. And there's a lot of requirements if we were to get to League 2 that we'd have to meet. So we're trying to make sure that we build a club that can actually withstand success. And then, as you said, we believe that there's an opening. Football is more and more of a lifestyle brand, not just a sporting experience. That's not just true of football. It's of course true here for lots of different types of sports, but football in Europe is the whole thing. There are other sports, but people in Portugal, football is number 1, and number 2 is really like number 8. It's not right. It's not it's not a close call. And Lisbon is such an incredibly hot place from people moving there. I mean, it's warm too and very sunny. It's Lisbon's sunniest capital. Rather, Europe's sunniest capital. But there were 300,000 people that have moved there in the last 5 years. And so we think there's a huge opening for those folks, most of whom are European and are looking for community and looking for opportunity to sort of to connect. And that's what football offers. So our goal is in 2 years, let's say, Rob, you land in Lisbon, you pick up Time Out, or you don't pick it up anymore, you go online. And Time Out tells you, here are the 5 things you should do when you come to Lisbon. And number 3 is, visit the Tapadinha, which is the name of our stadium. Awesome name. And not just for a football game, but be there any day of the week. There's something going on, something exciting, something fun, something very Lisbon. That's our goals.
Excellent. Well, it's a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to being there one day soon and checking it out in person. But Giff, it's an interesting life you've led. It continues to be fascinating, that evolution. We started talking about your early experiences and being involved in the public sector, and now running a Portuguese football club. It's never dull. It's always fun to be your friend and hear what you're up to. So really appreciate the time and the conversation and our friendship. Give my love to Pam and your boys and the rest of your family.
Well, to your family too. And I don't know, but when do we get to do the podcast on you, man? You're just as interesting and exciting as a guy.
I appreciate that. That'll be hunkered down somewhere. The next time I'm in New York, we'll take a table in the back of a good ethnic restaurant and talk it through, maybe without any cameras or audio.
No, we need the people need to hear it. The people need to hear it.
I appreciate it, Giff. Here's to a long friendship ahead, and really enjoyed the conversation.
My pleasure.
We'll talk soon, Giff. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again for joining us on the Super Performers Podcast today, powered by 4100 FS. I hope you not only enjoyed listening, but you found the insights thought-provoking and relevant. We'll be back soon with another episode of Super Performers, Insights from the Driven. This is Rob Herman. Bye for now.